I'm afraid in a few years' time, people will look back and think, what on earth were we doing when we're attacking some of the most vulnerable people at the most vulnerable point of their lives and not giving them the support that they need? I think it's an utter disgrace, and I do believe it's time that the media showed a lot more responsibility about factually reporting what's truly happening.
And it's been 5 years since the government promised to ban so-called conversion therapy. The new law to ban all forms of conversion therapy in England and Wales, including practices aimed at transgender people, is reportedly sitting on the Prime Minister's desk awaiting final sign-off. But it comes after years of debate over the scope of the bill, especially when it comes to gender identity. Our next guest used to sit on the government's LGBT advisory panel, but resigned in 2021 due to its slow progress on the ban. Jayne Ozanne, welcome to the programme. Morning to you.
Good morning.
Some of our listeners won't really know what conversion therapy is. What do you see it as, and why should it be banned?
Well, it's an umbrella term which basically refers to any practice that seeks to change, cure, or suppress a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. And it can take place in many forms, in counselling sessions, in religious settings, in the home. And sadly can go from anything from prayer and verbal abuse through to physical abuse, and even sadly in many cases we're hearing now corrective rape. So it's, as I say, it's a broad term, but it's basically the aim is always to try and change somebody or suppress someone from what their actual inherent identity or sexual orientation is.
And I guess where it becomes tricky is what someone's actual identity is not always a straightforward notion, is it? Particularly when it comes to gender. People can be very fluid. People can be experimental, thoughtful about what their gender expression should be. And therefore, it is legitimate to discuss that with them and maybe even guide them in various directions at certain points during the process. That is one side of the ball that's not the same as fundamentally saying you can't do this. And can a ban allow the former while still prohibiting the latter?
Absolutely. And I think there's been a lot of stoking of fear and dare I say, misreporting on this. We brought together a very eminent group of lawyers, international human rights lawyers, chaired by Baroness Helena Kennedy, KC, to advise the government on how we define conversion therapy and how we look at banning it. And they came up with the phrase, anything with a predetermined purpose. So when the perpetrator has a mindset that says you have to be straight, or you have to be what we call cisgendered, i.e. not transgender. Of course, it's really important to have safe spaces where people can be challenged, where people can explore who they are. Some people know from the very first moment they, interact with other children or take their first steps. Others, like me, it took 40 years. And so we need spaces where we can be challenged, where we can explore, but they need to be safe spaces where the person who is helping us, the person in power, is not directing us that we have to be a certain way. That's when harm hurts.
What if the argument is that you have to pause, or you have to think about other aspects of this, where the element of compulsion, such as it is not saying you have to be male or have to be female, but you might say to a 16-year-old, in my view, as a parent or a teacher, for example, in my view, I think you must pause, think this through. Is that level of compulsion caught by this?
Well, obviously, every case is different, but the question is, who does the pause serve? If it's truly serving the young person and they are okay with that, that's fine. They have rights too, But if the pause is purely because the parent or the religious leader is themselves uncomfortable and doesn't like the fact that they're being presented with a young person who is saying that they know themselves to be trans or they know themselves to be gay, then their rights and their needs need to be paramount. And what we are seeing, sadly, is a lot of examples of young children and, well, I say young teenagers who are being told that they cannot be who they know themselves to be because it doesn't fit with their parents' idea of norms or cultures. And that causes great harm. And when you say pause to someone going through puberty, you will create an even deeper harm, because we know that actually trying to stop a process will cause much longer problems in the long term.
But trying to intervene in that process can cause long-term problems as well. That's the thorny issue right there, isn't it?
That's ridiculous. I mean, forgive me, but there again, I don't know what your agenda is, but there is always...
I haven't got an agenda at all. I'm just interested.
Well, the question itself is very leading.
Why?
When so I think what you're talking about, by the sounds of it, is puberty blockers. And the whole point of puberty blockers is to give people far more time so that they can come to a point of peace about who they are, rather than going through puberty, which then requires extensive surgery, extensive interventions, and cause significant...
I understand the argument. I don't have an agenda, but my point is it's not a neutral act. A puberty blocker is not itself a neutral act. It's still an intervention. Even if it might forestall later intervention, it's still an intervention inherently in itself.
Well, yes, but it's an intervention because the young person presenting you is telling them this is who you are. And the problem we're seeing in society is that it's often parents with a very strict agenda, a very religious agenda, or religious leaders themselves who are causing such deep psychological harm. You just need to look at the mental health statistics, the levels of attempted suicide, of depression, of self-harm, which we know is happening amongst the trans community because they are not getting the support they need. The biggest news story that hardly anybody seems to want to cover is the fact that so many young trans children cannot get access to the healthcare they need because it's all been closed down because of people who are intervening without the knowledge, I'm afraid, and trying to say we should be stopping this. We need to prioritise the health and the well-being of young people, ensure the therapists and the counsellors and the medical professions have the access they need to the drugs that they need and the gender identity clinics that young people need. We've got terribly long waiting lists, and we need to ensure these young people are getting the support that they can get in, frankly, every other country across European Union at the moment. So we need to catch up and be wise to the harm we're causing.
But these places have been closed down, like the Tavistock, for example, because there is concern about the practices of how they conduct themselves. I guess the issue, I suppose, that we're getting into, maybe you think there's the straightforward answer to this is that it can be legislated and it's fine, is that the area we're talking about is a contested one. It's contested in all sorts of...
contested because of fake news and fake articles by people who don't like trans people and are trying to whip up a storm.
Is that why the Tavistock was closed? Is that why the Tavistock was closed? Because of that?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Tavistock. It's one clinic with some cases that have been called into question, but it's not been replaced, and that is a government decision which is causing significant harm to hundreds, if not thousands, of young people. And we need to prioritise their healthcare. We've got a very anti-trans agenda, both within the government and within elements of the media, that is pushing a false narrative that is causing great harm. And it will, I'm afraid, in a few years' time, people will look back and think, what on earth were we doing when we're attacking some of the most vulnerable people at the most vulnerable point of their lives and not giving them the support that they need? I think it's an utter disgrace, and I do believe it's time that the media showed a lot more responsibility about factually reporting what's truly happening.
Jayne Ozanne, great to speak to you. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you.
That's Jayne Ozanne there, used to sit on the LGBT advisory panel.